All right, so welcome everyone to the Brand DIY Tuesday, and we are super thrilled to have master brand specialist, big brand specialist, Mike Welling, friend of mine. We've known each other since before electricity, and we want to talk today with Mike about learnings for Brand DIY audience from master big brand specialist. So Mike, welcome to the show.
Well, hello, Mark. Thanks very much for having me.
Now, I want to dig right in. You and I got to know each other when I was working at Palmer Jarvis, DDB, and you were at Unilever, and you were working with the likes of Rob Gannett and company. And this is sort of a very, very cool time in Unilever's history. There are a lot of bright people there, and a lot of bright people you were working with at Ogilvy and at Palmer Jarvis, etc. I want to talk today about three big pieces of business that. Two that you and I worked on, one that you have insights on. And from each of those, I want to sort of then pull back and say, what are the learnings for somebody who's DIYing their own brand? Cool with you?
Sure.
All right. So the first piece of business, it's something that you and I think, got to know each other on, and that is Degree deodorant. Super high aluminum deodorant. It kills the stink in 20-year-old boys. It works extremely well.
It worked on others than 20-year-old boys.
Well, I know I worked on 24, 25-year-old boys because that's what I was. So it worked like crazy, this stuff. So we created a really cool campaign. Do you want to describe sort of the origins of that campaign?
Well, I mean,
I can.
You go ahead and talk about in terms of.
I'm going to talk about Degree. What a brand DIY person can pull out of Degree. If you look on the logo of a stick of Degree, what you're going to see is a little circle, and that circle has a going up temperature gradient, sort of like you'd see on a gauge, a steam gauge, and it goes from cool to hot. And what we did, we seized on that sort of that visual. And the thing about Degree was that this stuff works when you're really under the gun. And folks don't know this, but if you do research into deodorant, what you find out is that as you get more stressed, as you get more anxious, you sweat more, you stink more. And that's when Degree really kicks in, when the meter starts to go to hot. And I remember that was what we based the entire campaign on. Is we created this universe where people would get into a situation where they'd be a little bit stressed, more stressed, and extremely stressed. And once we came up with that, then what you can do, you can take that to this logical insanity, which is you take it all the way from, well, I'm nervous about a test to I'm nervous about the most important test in the whole wide world. And you can make it totally zany, which is what we did. So that's where we came up with this. What are your thoughts? Like, just feeding back the whole idea of insights, consumer insights, things like that.
Yeah, you just said the key word. I think the fundamental is there's insights. There's insights about the consumer. Why are people even using the category? Why is this product even relevant to them? What are the stress tests literally in that particular category as to where you count on something like a deodorant working? Then you're coming back and you're looking at insights about the brand. You've got to look inside the category, the competitive set, and so on, and what ultimately helps to make you distinctive, and what properties can you own that somebody else can't own. So when you come back and you talk about leveraging a visual device like you did, and from the creativity out of the packaging and so on, that's something that Degree could end up owning and speak about the degree of stress somebody was feeling, but help to keep you dry. That was very different than what other deodorants in the market could be able to say. So fundamentally, I think a key message for everybody out there, effective branding and effective marketing ultimately comes back to insight. Mm-hmm. Insight about your category, insight about the brand, insight. The agency that I had been working with up until about 2 years ago actually trademarked a little saying that we used to use in our presentations all the time. It was insight, ideas, engagement. That you had to start everything from the standpoint of what's an insight about the brand, about the consumer, the problem you're trying to solve. How are you ultimately, as a brand, helping to make anybody's life better or easier? Because if you're not, nobody's going to buy you. There's no need for you. So, but once you've got the insights, you can leverage those insights into a multitude of creative ideas And then the engagement part comes in terms of bringing them to life in the marketplace. But that's where you come back. What's the insight about why I'm relevant? What's the insight about why I'm distinctive as a brand? So that was one in terms of from a degree perspective. You know, one of the most famous ones that I actually worked on, it wasn't with you, but it was with the folks at the then Ammirati Purist, but it was the Sunlight laundry brand. There was Sunlight, which is a brand
that was a monster campaign. Hey, that was such a good campaign.
Well, it went ahead and it became the Go Ahead Get Dirty campaign, which actually became a platform that Unilever leveraged globally. Mm-hmm. So that's pretty cool when you can actually be in little old Canada and you can work on your distinctive little Canadian brand, and then it ends up becoming a brand proposition that goes around the globe. But there were some fundamentals about that particular proposition. Tide was the major competition. Tide was the brand that they owned clean. So you can't own clean. Tide was the one, I remember when we did some research and people extrapolating and so on, if your washing machine broke down, you'd call Tide. But if you
hold on a minute. I'm going to interrupt right here because I have to laugh. I talk a lot about choosing your niche and choosing your brand word. Volvo equals safe, Porsche equals fast, you know. If you're up against a competitor in laundry detergent and they own clean, oh my God, that kind of limits you.
Well, then you have to start looking for what are the other differences. So Tide, though, was pretty serious. They were owned clean, but they were also very good at making you feel guilty. If you wanted to invite one of the two brands over for dinner, you'd rather have Sunlight over for dinner. It was the friendlier brand. It was the more approachable brand. Then you break it back down. You start reverse engineering. Why do people buy laundry detergents in the first place? Mm-hmm. It's because they're living life.
Right.
And out of that proposition and out of a lot of focus groups and talking to a lot of consumers came the proposition about it was an invitation to get dirty, go ahead, get dirty. And so where they own clean and made you feel guilty if your colors weren't white and starched and what have you, we went out and celebrated people running through mud puddles and throwing mud at one another and basically living life with the confidence that the product would get them clean.
You know, that reminds me, Method stole that platform, right? The whole idea of Method was, which was people against pollution, people against toxic or something like that. And what they showed was basically naked people playing, naked people cleaning the house. And it was just a hilarious sort of thing, which was celebrating sort of just let your freak flag fly, be normal, and have some fun with it, you know?
Right. I think the key thing about that Sunlight example is how do you turn, when you sit there and think there are no growth and there's no opportunity, how do you turn around and flip a situation on its head and look at it from a completely different direction? And I think right now, you know, we are in a very interesting and challenging time to be in the world of brand and marketing. On the one hand, you've got companies scrambling so that budgets are getting pulled back and cut. Everybody's reevaluating because, let's face it, it's a lot easier to cut your marketing budget than it is to shut down a factory or a store or what have you. You've got capital costs, you've got other costs and so on. When it comes back to running a P&L, that there are things that you can't do. You also end up having people, when they are panicking, they forget at the end of the day that marketing and branding is actually an investment. And they tend to think of it as an expense. So you've got to validate and rationalize for people, once again, that your job is that you're in helping them invest, or you're investing in yourself and you're looking to drive a return on that particular investment. That has to be grounded in insights about the category, the brand, and so on. Right now, every brand that's out there has to stop and question, I knew what the relevance of my brand was prior to COVID. What's the relevance of my brand now? Because
I always say it's like all the pillars have been shaken loose and things are moving around. So people are willing to get rid of things that are tried and true and adopt something new because everything seems to be up in the air.
Everything's up in the air. I mean, from COVID, the US election, the financial system, the rules about how everything is supposed to work are all being challenged right now. Defund the police, all these kinds of things. Everything's coming up for reconsideration. This is where really strong brands get to leverage their equity. This is why you keep investing in your brand and you build a brand, because you become a trust mark. And right now, in a period of great uncertainty, lots of people are looking for something that's calming and reassuring. Lots of people are having to reflect not just on their purchase habits and consideration about what they might buy, they're having to reflect back on their families, whether they're going to have a job, what they can afford to do, has somebody in their household been negatively affected by COVID and so on. So that's a very scary time. But the other side of it is it opens the door to a whole bunch of new opportunities and possibilities. So now my counsel to folks would be step back and say, what was the fundamental core about why I was relevant in the first place? Mm-hmm. And then how am I going to make myself relevant again? What has fundamentally changed? And don't jump to conclusions. So you and I had chatted before about the importance in terms of research and strategy. Mm-hmm. And there's a whole bunch of neat ways that you can get research relatively inexpensively.
Talk to me about that, because that's a big one. Most folks, I go on the very, very fundamental level. I interview customers or potential customers. I interview stakeholders. But talk to me. I mean, we used to endure focus groups and online polls and stuff like that. And focus groups, I hate them. But talk to me about some research that would be very, very useful to somebody who's small and scrapping their way up.
Well, I don't hate focus groups. I actually still think that there's a value in focus groups, but you don't need
great sandwiches and warm Coca-Cola, right?
You don't necessarily need these days to have a formal focus group to be able to get insight and feedback in terms of the marketplace. Mm-hmm. And I'll give you an example of somebody who I think is doing a brilliant job of this, and he's created a little career for himself. Mm-hmm. And that's Tony Chapman.
Yeah.
Chatter that matters and all sorts of other things. Tony has been great. I first knew Tony back in the 1980s when he first had Communique, and that was about helping companies stage big presentations, launches, and all that sort of thing.
Right.
He ended up recreating Communique, and it became a brand, more of a considered an activation type of agency as opposed to a real creative.
That's how I knew him, yeah.
Okay, but then ultimately he was smart enough and successful enough. He was the first guy in that particular application and marketing who went into the Marketing Hall of Legends. He subsequently, that business is sold, and he's reinvented himself as this moderator and speaker for a whole bunch of, he was doing conventions and that sort of thing, but now he's doing it and having to do it in a podcast form and so on. What Tony does that's great is he leverages LinkedIn. And he uses LinkedIn and he uses his network to pose questions to people. So quite often I'll be on a list of about 25 or 30 people that Tony will throw an idea out, and he wants to spark a little conversation amongst us. Not that dissimilar than what you're doing with BrandDIY here in terms of getting some feedback from people. It's incredible the amount of insight and understanding that you can extrapolate through a methodology like that. So you can leverage social media today, even if you're stuck in your house and you can't go to the office and you can't field big, market research studies and so on. Reading what's happening in terms of social media, engaging with your friends, using them as a proxy in terms of a focus group or consumer insight, put your finger on the pulse. You can extrapolate an awful lot of things and test an awful lot of theories pretty quickly.
I love social media is great. And you know what? If you have a brand question, it's easy to approach people because you've got it's almost like you've got a press pass or a uniform. You can hide behind. You say, "I'm going to ask you a question. I'm going to ask you a question," and you know what? People are super willing to come out and give you the straight goods. I find.
Absolutely, and you don't have to have everybody agree with you. So I'll give you an example of that. So I happen to have a couple of second cousins who live in Jackson, Mississippi. And we have very different perspectives on the president of the United States right now. And I quite often get on Facebook people who are friends saying, who are these people? Why are they even your friends? And so on. And the thing that I tell them is that I use them as an insight into that mindset and thinking. And I also use them to see whether there's anything that I can say that actually shifts their perspective or opinion. Now that's in the world of talking about Donald Trump and politics and a whole bunch of other things that deal with social issues. But it's just an example as to how you can leverage your social media networks to start dialoguing with friends or friends of friends and use them to help extrapolate insight points, understanding about their parents, what's going on with their families, how are people feeling about this? Does this make you happy? Does this make you sad? All the kinds of things that you would end up asking in a focus group or you'd put into a big long questionnaire, but you don't have time, you can extrapolate a bunch of that. And then you know what? You form hypotheses and you can trust your gut a little bit. Mm-hmm. So the nice thing right now is that while everybody's foundations of their perspectives and beliefs may be up for grabs, that also means when you're selling a business proposition to people, you can tell them, we don't have time, we don't have the time or the money to have to field great big studies amongst 2,000 users. We don't have the resources. We've got to act a lot faster than that. So here's the hypothesis, here's the insight, here's the rationale. You build your argument, and then you get people brave and you go.
This is something I could do. Anybody can do.
Well, yes, you could even do this.
Even I could do this.
You could even do this.
With 2 fingers typing, I could do this.
2 fingers typing.
Well, talk to me about Axe. Talk to me about Axe and fighting City Hall and inheriting a brand that has an amazing brand equity to it. Talk to me about that.
Okay, well, just so people, for a little bit of background, I was at Unilever for almost 20 years, and I sat on global teams, regional teams. I led the soap and detergents business in Canada. I was responsible for the foods portfolio in Canada. I was responsible for deodorants, which is where you got back to Degree, and Axe was there. The thing I would say about Axe is if you have a great insight, steal shamelessly, right? Act fast, steal shamelessly. It can be fresh and new to the marketplace. When I was looking after the deodorants portfolio, Axe was this huge success in Europe and in Latin America, and even in the Middle East to some extent, less so, but Europe and in Latin America. And we were starting at that particular point in time to have to start to report or work together as North America as opposed to Canada and the US. And my American colleagues were very protective, but they were also tended to be very conservative about how they would try and do things. And they also wanted to try and reinvent everything, or as opposed to recognizing that speed, grabbing an idea, sticking in the market and being first to the market was actually a much better thing to do. So Axe, I went through a long battle of trying to get Axe into the Canadian marketplace. We were having a debate. The Americans wanted to reinvent it. They wanted to put it into, like, I think, a San Antonio test market. And I tried to say to them, listen, for the cost of what it'll cost you to do a San Antonio test market, you could launch it in Canada and you could find out how the product's going to be received across all the channels of distribution. And you don't need to change a damn thing about the advertising because you're selling sex to teenage boys. Right? That's what Axe was doing. It was selling success with girls to teenage boys. The advertising did that. Steal shamelessly, get it out there. What ended up happening was the Americans vetoed that idea. They ended up trying to reinvent Axe. They did it badly. Ultimately, what happened was Axe ended up coming to Canada for the most part the way it was being presented around the world. So, and it was a huge success. So, understand great creative. Don't be afraid to steal great creative. Be the first to grab good ideas. You know, one of the things about the internet today is that you can find great ideas anywhere around the world. If you can be the first to exploit them in your marketplace, guess what? You win.
There's also, I mean, if you see an idea in cars, you could put it into dishwasher soap. You know, so yeah, suddenly it's yours. You know, I love taking ideas, taking one idea from car, an idea from, you know, ballpoint pens, sticking them together, turning into dishwasher. So it's like, go ahead, get dirty, not an original idea. You know, I'm sure it's been done a million times in different places. There are only 8 notes in the musical scale. And so, you know, it's just how you play them, and you can have so much fun. And what I love today that we didn't have is that we can pop a campaign out is at blinding speed at virtually no cost. Last week, I did a show on doing radio without buying radio spots, without buying a production studio. I said, you know what, screw it. I'm going to do a radio commercial by myself. I'll give myself 20 minutes to do a commercial on GarageBand. And I cranked it out. and you can do it. And
Sure.
that's what I remember one of the worst things about working on big brands or working in the 90s on big brands is that you get a TV commercial and it costs you $500,000. And as the price goes up, the number of eyes on it go up. And so it's terrifically liberating to go, I don't know, I got 20 minutes on a video commercial.
Right. And you never know how well that's going to work. You know, one of the best things that ever happened to me in my career was I worked in the UK for a couple of years. And I was very lucky. I worked at Lever UK at the time. They're based in Kingston. It's near Wimbledon in London. And it was one of the oracles of marketing in the packaged goods world. And because they were British, they had a lovely sense of humor, and they really understood the power of communication to help build brands. And there were an awful lot of smart people. And you learned in that particular environment how to help come up with more distinctive, creative communication and run with it. And there was a guy that I worked with who worked with me. I was in the European brand group for the equivalent of what's Vim over here in Canada. And there was a guy named Dave Allen who was there with another guy in the office at the same time. They ended up setting up a brand consultancy afterwards that was hugely successful. I think they just sold it last year to one of the big consulting companies. But they had a brilliant name for it. It was called What If? And I think what you're talking about when you talk about taking something from a different category, a different idea, why is that good here? What if? One of the number one things that I would do from a strategic planning, anytime we would do business planning, long-term planning, and so on, to get people to think bigger and broader about the opportunity, the question would be not how are we going to grow this business by 5% or 10% next year? The question I would ask is, what do we have to do to double this business in 5 years? Because that forces people to have to ask the question, well, how on earth could we possibly do that? Well, what if we did this? What if we did this? What if we did this? And if you think big like that and you start reverse engineering back the steps to help you get there, suddenly you can see a path forward and away you go, and you can enjoy tremendous growth. So what if, and that whole notion of testing, theory, you've talked an awful lot about brainstorming, get yourself, you spend a couple of your podcasts have talked about the whole creative thought process, give yourself some room to think, go off and do something else, come back, but don't be afraid to ask yourself, what if, why can't this be? Why can't this be? Yeah. And if it ultimately comes back to an insight about why that would make your product or service better for someone, then it'll make your product or service more desirable to more people.
I was talking about this yesterday. The same thing as what if, it's how might we grow this? How might we make it better? Because when you're doing brands, a lot of times you're talking about how do we best communicate this, which is a super lame place to start from. If you start from a position, how do we grow this thing double? You start to reach for a whole bunch of stuff because you're not going to do it with a print ad and a radio spot.
Yeah.
You got to think about what can I leverage? Can I give some to the president? Can I, do a stunt with a guy falling out of the space capsule parachuting?
Right.
You start to think of zany stuff that people talk about on their own. It's wonderful. I want to be respectful of your time. I want to finish off on one of the funnest projects that I ever did.
Okay.
With you, which is the Slim Fast stuff. And I want to give folks some background to this. Mike and I worked together on Slim Fast, which was an ancient brand. It had been around since, I think, the Druids. And they had generally this sort of advertising where it was testimonials. I used to be overweight and I cried a lot. It was like a predecessor to reality.
It was the same advertising that everybody in the category did. There was nothing distinctive about it. And the problem,
it was awful.
You and I started working on that Slim Fast brand when Unilever acquired Best Foods. Best Foods had the Slim Fast brand, and Best Foods had acquired that business from the family that had owned that business.
In Florida.
Problem with that was that a family member from the original business was still involved with protecting daddy's vision and way of marketing. Mm-hmm. But we were all about driving growth. That was our mandate, drive growth. And we had to think about things differently. We had to break the rules for the category. So just like the sunlight example earlier about go ahead, get dirty was breaking the rules of the category, Slim Fast was also about breaking the rules of the category because, well, I don't know if you've got a copy of the ad there or something, but
I posted it on the site, but I will repost all three of the wedding posters after our conversation.
Yeah, well, you know, you had the little Russian dolls, you had the bride, you had typical wedding cake where instead of the bride and groom standing on top holding hands, the bride had fallen through the top of the cake because she was a little too heavy or so on.
Yeah.
That was a campaign that was targeted specifically against people looking to get married. And the insight was every bride is trying to lose weight before her wedding day. So how do you help them do it? So that was a niche campaign. It wasn't the whole of the Slim Fast campaign, but it was very much targeted against potential or new brides, people getting married, but it spoke to a universal issue to people about how do I.
What I loved about it was two things. One, that we had to go toe to toe with our head office, the mothership, Gray, New York, one of the biggest ad agencies anywhere, to fight them toe to toe for this.
Yeah.
Because they wanted a soft focus girl, happy as ever. And I'm just like, it's so awful, I'm going to throw up. And they said, you got to run that. You got to run that. And we said, no, we want to run. What if you don't do it? And they go, you can't do that. And they're talking about fighting, you know, my insight versus your insight. Their insight was, if you show a lady who is overweight, every lady is paranoid. They're going to hate you for it. And so we were lucky because we had two young ladies who were both getting married, who were the writer and the art director on this. Absolutely. And they said, screw that. This is what we're thinking. And they said, we're gonna cheat the system. We're gonna do a judo flip. We're not gonna show actual ladies. We're gonna show little mannequin ladies. And every lady goes, oh, that's not me. Because it's a mannequin.
They were great. They were great. And one of those two ladies has actually done extremely well for herself. And she's now global creative director for Edelman.
Yeah.
No, she's for Edelman. No, she's gone with No Fixed Address with Serge.
Yeah, but she was Edelman, she was Taxi. She was.
Yeah. She just got back from Leo Burnett in Chicago as well. The thing that I would say to people, that one of the great lessons or one of the great mantras that we were working under at that time that Unilever was so smart about was they went through and they came up with a nice simple rule to evaluate communication. It was the ABC rule. Is it attention getting? Is it branded? And does it communicate? And the creative idea that opened the door all the time was it attention getting? Cut through the clutter. How are you going to be distinctive? And even, you know, today it's more important than ever. You're asking people who have a multitude of choices about how they're going to spend their time. Why should anybody invest any time in your messaging?
Yeah.
You better make sure it's relevant. You better make sure it hits some of the heartstrings or it gets them to stop and think. But if they don't notice it in the first place, you've wasted all your time and money and energy and strategy, production, media, the rest of it. So it's got to be attention getting. It's got to be branded back to you. That gets back to the insight. It's got to come back to you as a brand. It doesn't do any good to promote the category unless you're the market leader, and then it's got to communicate your intended message. If you can meet those three things, then you know you're going to get a great ROI on your communication.
That's just a wonderful lesson in discipline too. That so many people, they go, I got an idea for a beer ad, and you go, yeah, that in a quarter will get you a cup of coffee. The discipline to start everything with the brand strategy and don't let your cleverness get in the way of the strategy is really important. I want to cut ahead though, because we're running a little overtime here with you. But the second part that I loved about the Slim campaign is how it took on a life of its own. And I think it was testament to the fact that the campaign was so stripped back, it would work in any language. And so it did.
Yeah, it was visual, it could work anywhere. We did another one that we did was for the Knorr brand that we had. Once again, when we acquired Best Food, the Knorr brand that I inherited was creative, where it was all chefs in tall white hats and everything was brown and beige and so on. The fundamental insight for a campaign that was created by DDB for us at the time was, if Campbell's made a mushroom soup, Knorr would make a wild mushroom soup. There was something that was more exotic and interesting about Knorr. We left all the brown behind. Suddenly we came out with a campaign that used a green background because the packaging for the brand was green, and it used kitchen utensils to create foods. So it used plates to be like scales on a fish. It used spoons going around to look like clams or mushrooms or what have you. It cut through. It was so distinctive. I remember going to a global meeting where everybody on the Kenora global team was supposed to bring their advertising. We stuck it up on the wall. The only stuff that stuck out in the marketplace was the Canadian stuff, and it was doing home runs for us in terms of marketplacing.
But you know, I got my start in Hong Kong, then I went to Germany, and then I went to Canada. And when I did stuff, I saw stuff like the Kenora stuff. It was a wonderful time to be doing marketing and advertising, because the fight was to simplify and reduce your message. And coming from a market where English was vastly smaller second language, like Hong Kong, and not only that, but the culture thought differently. It wasn't even that the words were different, it was culturally different. You needed to have ideas that were so simple, like a bride falling through a wedding cake, or fish scales made out of a plate, where you go, oh, you could be 6, you could be 96, you could be speaking any language in the world. You go, I get it. I don't want to be overweight on my wedding.
Right. The key comes back, be distinctive, understand an insight about the category, then understand an insight about the brand. I mean, if we had more time, I'd spend some time talking about a more recent example that I worked on for about 10 years at the agency I was at, which was York University. And taking
talk to us about that. If you got time, then I'm sure our folks have time.
Taken being a second-tier university to being something that was desirable and hitting great growth rates. But fundamentally, York isn't like a traditional university. It's a commuter school. It's not a destination school that people fly in from across the country to say, hey, I'm going to Dalhousie, I'm going to University of Victoria, I'm going to UBC or something like that. York is predominantly a commuter school. It was started in the mid-1960s. It was the antithesis to what University of Toronto is. So fundamentally, that was positioning York as the progressive university that champions new ways of thinking. So if U of T is the Ivy League type of school, York is the progressive university champion new ways of thinking, which meant the campaign for York University had to look dramatically different than anything else that happened in university advertising and communication. Mm-hmm. And I don't have the visuals to show you, but I would just encourage people, you could go, a couple of the campaigns we did for them have won Cassie Awards on a previous iteration, which was about testimonials for students. You know, there was an example in terms of using creativity. Campaign that we did that won Cassie Awards, which were effectiveness awards for those who don't understand what a Cassie Award used to be. Now they've called them the Effies, or shifted around, called them the Effies. But the Cassie Award, it was a testimonial. And when you're a university like University of Toronto, where you've got Banting and Best, who created insulin back in the 1920s, you've got history on your side. When you're a young institution like York, you don't have that. So our testimonial wasn't about things that people did in the past. Our testimonial was showing students speaking about what they were going to do in the future. In 2027, my blah, 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 blah. Mm-hmm. It was great. It got people inside the York world. It got people outside the York world to stop and start taking York much more seriously, and believing that it wasn't a second-tier university. It was actually a first-tier university.
I'm gonna grab some of those ads and I'm gonna post them up on the discussion board here.
Great. And you should look at the campaign that's been running in the last few years, which is far more. It was a great campaign because it used 100% stock visuals to create videos. It went into cinema ads. It went into out-of-home ads. It was print ads. I'll send you some of that.
Yeah, send me some stuff. I'm going to throw it up to the folks to take a look at.
The key being about that for message for people, cut through the clutter. Yeah. Whatever you do, cut through the clutter. You know, be relevant to people, have an insight, understand your audience. I used to have a little test that I would use as a client all the time when people would present creative to me, and it was my tummy test.
I remember that.
Did it make me tingle? Did it make me a little bit nervous? Because if it did, that meant it was getting me excited and it would get other people excited. And as long as you could make sure that you were also being insightful and relevant in terms of your messaging, then trust the creativity. So
awesome. I've got one question that Connie asked here in the stream. She said, what strategies do brands use to recover from a life-threatening blunder? And I went back and I said, describe the blunder. But have you ever had this happen to you where a brand did a major misstep? I'm in the world of Unilever. I mean, I'm sure it's happened.
Where the brand did a major misstep? No, I do remember having a product launched under it was the Imperial Margarine brand. It was called Coloness, and we were under, Unilever was trying to drive some extra growth, and we were looking to introduce a product, and we did an ad campaign that was terrible. It was done by Ogilvy, the same people who did, litmus ads and Dove ads. And
the Natural Beauty, Nancy and Janet, right?
Yeah, Nancy and Janet were there, and the creative team that came up with the concept completely missed the boat. So I remember losing $1 million or a couple $1 million on a product launch. But the thing about something that's bad, unless it's something that's, if you're looking at a Jessica Mulrooney kind of situation, that's going to take time to heal. And she can thank her husband, Ben Mulrooney, for doing an excellent job and coming out, demonstrating some contrition. She's staying out of the limelight. It's going to take a long time. I believe their brand will come back. His brand will come back, and the family brand will come back. Whether hers comes back or not remains to be seen. Mm-hmm. But the great thing about bad advertising is that most people forget it. Mm-hmm. Because it was bad. So if your brand disaster is something like that, great. If it's something that is...
What if it's a massive product failure? Connie just got back and she said airbags, and I can only imagine what that means.
Yeah, okay. So Takata airbags, what do you end up doing about it? All you can do is, in some cases, you may just have to kiss that business goodbye.
Yeah.
You may have to. It may be... irreparable and may not be worth the investment in terms of coming back. But the other side of it is you can actually learn if I go back and I think probably Maple Leaf Foods when they faced the listeria issue and how Michael McCain handled that in terms of from a public relations. It's not quite dropping your pants and demonstrating your humbleness, but that's what you have to do. You have to say, this was a big mistake. We tried to do all the right things. It didn't work out. We're going to do the proper thing and we're going to fix it. Mm-hmm. So if you had an established business and you faced a major problem like the airbags, I guess all you could do is come back and try and reinforce to people, this is what our testing was. We got it wrong. Don't fight reparations. You've got to make the reparations. Mm-hmm. Demonstrate, you got to earn trust back.
We've seen how not to do it in the example of Volkswagen Dieselgate and United Airlines, where they drag the guy off the plane and then basically
terrible.
And you're like, the more you PR this, the longer the fire is going to burn. In fact, the more gasoline gets thrown on it. People aren't complicated. They really want to see you bend over and take a whacking, and then say sorry and be humble about it, and try to humbly come back. If you try to PR it, it's unbelievable the effect that it can have. The gas on the fire.
Yeah, people want truthfulness and they want sincerity. It's the authenticity. Well, authenticity, you could be a bad person and that could be being authentic, but they're actually looking for truthfulness and sincerity and demonstration that you actually care.
Mike, thank you so much for taking the time. And for everybody who's watching, Mike is a member of our group. If you want mentorship, if you have a question, reach out to him in BrandDIY. He's here, and so you can tap this massive big brand brain if you're launching your own DIY brand. He's there for you. I just set you up. I set you up, my friend.
Perfect. Okay. So if we ever manage to get together again in person, you'll have to buy me a beer for that.
I'll have to buy you more than the beer. Let's see what people do with this sort of.
I hope so. I hope some of that conversation proves to be helpful for folks, stimulate some thinking, and it's a tough time to be a marketer. But I must say, people react emotionally and justify rationally. That's why branding and communication is so powerful. So stick with it. Don't give up. If it's not working, just challenge yourself. Ask yourself, what if, and look for that insight to say, how am I going to make life better or easier for somebody else? So
Thank you so much, man.
Okay, take care.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye.